Welcome to Story Explained. Today we are going to cover the latest series called Conversations with Friends. We will recap each episode in detail, so stick around till the very end. Episode 1. The story takes place in Dublin. Frances and Bobby are two best friends who were previously in a relationship, but still continue to maintain their friendship afterwards. At night, Frances and Bobby performed a spoken-word poem about female empowerment in front of a live audience. After the performance, they met Melissa Baines, a well-known author who praised them for their poem. Melissa soon learnt the nature of Frances and Bobby's relationship and that Frances was the author of the poem. Bobby was quite flirtatious throughout their conversation and ultimately took Melissa's number when Melissa suggested that the three of them continue the conversation some other time. At night, Frances did a quick internet search on Melissa and found out that she has a husband, Nick Conway, who is an actor. Frances sent Nick's photo over to Bobby, calling him a trophy husband. Frances and Bobby eventually met up with Melissa again, this time to have a swim in the sea before they head back to Melissa's place. When both Melissa and Bobby had their quick showers, Frances took this opportunity and explored the house, looking into the study room. Then, Nick returned from walking the dog and he met Frances, and eventually Bobby. The four of them then had some food on the dining table, where Bobby tried to start a conversation with Nick considering he studied English and French, while Frances studied English. However, Nick's replies were rather short. Melissa also tried to understand Frances' point of view regarding the permanence of her writing, but Frances had a difficult time explaining her thoughts. Bobby eventually had to butt in and tell them that Frances is a communist. Then, Bobby and Melissa went out to have a smoke where they had a more natural and light-hearted conversation. With only Frances and Nick on the dining table, they both tried to have a conversation and surprisingly, their conversation flowed better with just the two of them. Nick revealed that he is now in a play called Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, and Frances asked if she could go watch him as she loved the play when she first read it. Wary, Nick asked her if she was just being polite, but Frances told him she really wanted to go and Nick arranged for the tickets. The two then continue with their more comfortable conversation. One day, in the college library, Bobby told Frances that she thinks that it's weird that Nick and Melissa are married as Melissa is smart and interesting, while Nick barely opened his mouth. Bobby also confessed that she has a crush on Melissa, while Frances told Bobby that she found Nick interesting. When the day arrived, Frances went to see Nick's play. She waited for him after the play, but when she saw him greeted by more important people, she left and sent him a text instead, telling him that he was great in the play. Nick replied late that night and asked when she's performing next, to which Frances teased him if he was being polite. When Frances and Bobby were about to perform their next spoken-word performance, Frances was anxious as she looked around the crowd for signs of Nick. Although she was initially disappointed not to see him there, Frances was eventually relieved when she saw him coming in with Melissa. After the performance, the four of them had a drink. Frances reiterated that though Nick was great in his play, but Bobby confronted him on whether he feel conflicted playing a gay character when he himself is straight. When Nick told her he interpreted the character as bisexual, Bobby called him out for making bisexuality sound like a pit stop towards coming out as gay. She even revealed that Frances is bisexual and might feel offended by that. After the intense conversation, Bobby brushed it off in a casual way before proceeding to lead Melissa elsewhere to introduce her to her other friend, Philip. Again, Nick and Frances were left alone together. This time, Nick took this opportunity to apologize for being late and told Frances that he really liked her performance. Frances got very shy as Nick said that he did not know how to articulate his feelings and will instead write her an email full of compliments. The two enjoyed each other's company. Episode number 2 starts with Frances getting ready for Melissa's birthday party. Frances was conscious about how to wear her hair, but eventually decided to leave it down. At the party, Frances felt awkward mingling with random people and decided to go to the washroom upstairs. When she was about to head downstairs, she saw Nick smoking weed in his room. She popped in to say hi, but the dog came in and so, Nick closed the door after getting the dog out. In their private moment, Nick admitted that he was stoned and commented about Frances' red cheeks. The two felt an instant attraction and proceeded to kiss. Before Nick could say anything after, Frances hurriedly left the room. She then left the party. The next day, Frances took a train for a trip back home to visit her parents. Her parents were separated and so, she stayed with her mom while she was there. Frances' mother tried showing interest in her job, but Frances seemed disturbed, probably from the kiss. She told her mother about meeting Melissa and Nick, but did not mention about her attraction. In the afternoon, Frances visited her father, but her father seemed nonchalant. He continued to watch TV and eat his microwaved meal as Frances did the dishes. Before Frances left at night, her father offered to give her money for expenses. When she reached her mother's place, Frances received a text message from Nick telling her he was sorry about what happened. He apologized because he's older than her and that it was his wife's birthday. Frances apologized too, and the two decided to have a friendly chat over text after that. When Frances went back to Dublin, Bobby asked Frances about why she left the party early, but Frances did not tell her the truth. However, Bobby confessed that she and Melissa kissed during the party after Frances left. Frances was shocked by what happened because she felt really guilty about what happened with Nick. Bobby, on the other hand, framed it in a way where both she and Melissa had been flirting for a while. Melissa also thought the kiss was funny. Bobby also asked Frances if Frances disapproved of her kissing a married woman, but Frances denied it. During a book release, Frances and Bobby met Melissa and Nick again. From a conversation, they found out that Melissa is going to London for work but Nick would be staying in Dublin. Again, Frances and Nick managed to find some time for a private conversation, where Frances felt a little awkward. She suggested that they talk about what happened and that she would meet him. In response, Nick said he would like that. After they parted ways with Melissa and Nick, Bobby told Frances that she sensed a disconnect between the couple and was worried Melissa told Nick about their kiss. Frances commented that they seemed normal. After that, the two friends head to the club to dance the night away. The next morning, Frances received a message from Nick to meet up in the evening. Seeing how Frances was grinning after receiving the text, Bobby asked her what it was, but Frances again did not tell her. Frances put effort into getting ready and took the train in the afternoon. She received a text from Nick asking what she was doing and that made her happy. Episode number 3 is about Frances and Nick trying to figure out what their kiss meant. They decided to discuss it while Melissa is away in London. The affair begins from this episode. Frances arrived at Nick's place and kept her distance in the beginning. She didn't waste time telling Nick that she did not intend to be a homewrecker. But Nick replied saying his marriage has already survived several affairs on Melissa's end. Understanding his intention, Frances invited him to go upstairs and the two started their affair. After sex, Frances opened up that Nick was the first man she has ever had sex with because she has only been with Bobby before this. Nick was very accepting and told Frances that is up to her. Before Frances went home, during their conversation, Nick told her that he is going to Scotland for a few days for a TV show. One afternoon, when Bobby wanted to look through Nick's old, poorly rated movies, Frances refused to watch it and even defended Nick when Bobby said he is uninteresting and is just someone married to an interesting person. Noticing Frances' demeanor, Bobby pointed out that Frances has a crush on Nick. A frustrated Frances who could not reveal her affair angrily brushed Bobby's reaction as her being jealous. This minor argument caused a tension in their friendship. Both Frances and Nick continued to meet up several times those few days and also got to know each other, their relationship histories and their families. Frances was also there when Nick was packing to go to Scotland for work and then to Croatia for a holiday with Melissa for the rest of summer. Trying to be cool about it, Frances told Nick she had a great time and asked him what happens next, but Nick himself was not sure and told her that they'll have to see. The next morning, Bobby sent Frances a long text message apologizing if she made it sound like she was trying to embarrass Frances. In her message, she also called Frances out for stereotyping a gay person and putting a crush above their friendship. Frances did not reply and continued with her everyday life. After Nick had gone to Scotland, Frances still tried texting Nick, asking how things has been, but Nick's reply was very short and he did not even reply back when Frances wished him luck. After several days of waiting for Nick to reply, Frances wanted clarification. She sent a message to Nick asking if it was over and as a response, Nick called her as it was easier to talk. On the phone, Frances pretended not to care if Nick wants to end the affair while Nick struggled to give Frances an answer. Nick told her that they can't see each other now, apologized and was trying to explain. But Frances refused to hear any longer and cut the call short. Nick soon texted and said sorry for not expressing his thoughts well. The next morning, Frances immediately apologized to Bobby for not prioritizing their friendship. Bobby forgave her but found it weird that Frances took an awfully long time to get back to her. When Melissa came back, she joined Bobby and Frances for coffee. She had talked to Bobby beforehand and wanted a favor from Frances. Melissa wanted to use a line from Frances' poem, Diamonds in her book, and would like to ask permission. Shocked and unsure, Frances could not reply immediately but promised to look at the book first. Then, Melissa invited both Bobby and Frances to join Nick and her in their holiday in Croatia, saying that people come all the time and it is normal. Initially, Frances gave a lot of excuses such as cost and work to avoid going, but Bobby eventually persuaded her to join. As courtesy, Frances texted Nick that she is joining him and Melissa in Croatia and assured him that she did not intend on making a scene. However, she got a short reply from Nick saying that it's cool and that he'll see her. Episode number 4. After Frances and Bobby landed, Melissa picked the two of them up and drove them to her place. Although Nick was not around when they arrived, Melissa told them that everyone will arrive soon. Frances and Bobby were placed in separate rooms. After Frances showered and got settled, she went out and saw Bobby preparing food with another lady and man, named Evie and Derek. Turns out, it was Melissa's birthday. Nick was also back by then and he gave Frances a friendly peck on the cheek. Bobby commented that Nick lost a lot of weight and Nick told everyone the shoot in Scotland did not go well and the hours were long. The group then went out to the river for some swimming. Noticing that Frances was looking at Nick, Bobby asked Frances how big is her crush on Nick. When Frances asked her back about her kiss with Melissa, Bobby told her she thinks it wouldn't happen again. Throughout the swim and the evening, Frances could not take her eyes off Nick and Nick seemed to notice her as well. The next day, Melissa had to work. Therefore, Nick, Frances and Bobby went out for a tour around the island. At one point, they reached a beach and Bobby decided to go for a swim, leaving Nick and Frances alone on the beach. Nick took the opportunity to apologize for handling things badly and for hurting Frances' feelings. The two was in a better place after the talk. Frances couldn't sleep so she decided to go into the kitchen for some water. She saw Nick already there washing dishes. The two had a friendly chat in which Frances asked him if Melissa was awake. Nick told her that he wouldn't know because they do not sleep together. After bidding each other good night, they went back to their beds. Time passed and the whole group eventually got to go out again. This time, Frances received a call from her dad, wanting to talk about older times where they went to France. However, Frances told him she was busy. Nick was perceptive and noticed something wrong and so, Frances confided in him about her dad's alcoholism and her dependency on him for college money. Nick listened and gave her a different perspective from her father's side. At night, Bobby made plans with Frances to go hiking the next day. However, the next day, Frances changed her mind. She saw Nick hanging out alone and decided to stay back to write instead. Bobby was disappointed that her friend bailed on her, but was supportive of Frances wanting to write. Unfortunately, when Frances went back to Nick's spot, he was no longer there and therefore, she sat down there alone trying to write, but nothing came to her. One night, while the whole group was caroling, Nick and Frances started feeling a connection for each other again and kept stealing glances. Bobby noticed this and teased Nick about it during a game where Nick might have to kiss Frances if he got things wrong. Nick and Frances had fun for the very first time as the group played drinking games and teased each other. It was a good night for all of them. Late that night, Frances texted Nick and the two began flirting again. Frances then invited Nick to come over to her room and the two slept together again. After sex, they both revealed that they each were unsure whether the other person wanted the affair as much, but now they are clear on each other's perspective. They confessed their love for one another and told how much they cared. It was a blissful night for both of them. Early in the morning, Nick got up and lovingly kissed Frances before heading out. Episode number 5 recap. It's now their last vacation day in Croatia. Frances went down for breakfast and learnt that Melissa's book agent, Valerie, is coming over. Melissa was on edge preparing for Valerie's arrival. She went out to help Nick in setting plates for breakfast. During all the buzz, Frances managed to have another quick, private chat with Nick. The chat was lighthearted at first, but soon it took turn for the worst. She asked Nick when did he stop loving Melissa, and Nick bluntly replied that he never stopped loving his wife. This shocked Frances quite a bit, but they could not continue speaking as Bobby and the rest arrived for breakfast. Later on, Nick took the opportunity to get supplies at the market and asked Frances to help him. Frances couldn't refuse and agreed to go with him. It was an excuse to find a way to talk to one another without causing suspicion. When Frances was about to leave, Bobby came over to apologize for making a joke about Nick and Frances last night. However, Bobby also realized Nick's demeanor and told Frances that Nick was into her. Nevertheless, Frances brushed her comments off and went off with Nick. Unfortunately, just when Nick and Frances was about to leave, Evie decided to join them as Melissa was too on edge. Therefore, both of them could not discuss what happened. Evie stuck with them during whole shopping and they found little time alone with each other. They just managed to have a small chat where Frances asked Nick how Nick feels about her. But Nick could not respond straight away. He was serious about her but couldn't find the right words to express his feelings. When they returned from the market, Melissa was very stressed and snapped at Nick about lemons. It was a small fight between them. Then Nick helped Frances in putting the flowers in a vase. Frances then took a nap and when she woke up, she saw Nick and Bobby talking so she joined them. Melissa later came by to apologize to Nick. They both held hands and Nick left to help Melissa in the kitchen. Soon after, Valerie arrived and Melissa introduced Bobby and Frances. At night, the whole group celebrated Melissa's book publishing with Valerie. Frances couldn't help but feel left out as she saw Nick and Melissa getting comfortable together as Nick congratulated Melissa on her book. At dinner, Valerie asks how Nick is doing and he replies that he has started working again, which makes Frances curious. At one point, everyone left the table except for Frances, Valerie and Melissa. Valerie asked Melissa how Nick was doing, to which Melissa replied that Nick is now better. Turns out, Nick was in serious depression last year and Valerie revealed that the event had impacted Melissa's work. Disliking how Valerie was talking about Nick, Frances called the book agent out for making someone else's depression sound like a career impediment and she stormed off. Frances found Bobby and told her that she's frustrated at everyone there. The two friends eventually went back to the dining table, but Valerie had already gone to bed. Melissa and Frances then had a private chat in the kitchen where Frances apologized for her words. Melissa explained that Valerie is important to her professional career so she could not afford to offend her. Frances was understanding, but Melissa continued to explain that the previous year was rough for both her and Nick, and that she obviously loved Nick. This took Frances a little bit by surprise, but when Melissa asked Frances if there's anything she should know about, Frances got even more taken aback as this means that Melissa suspected something. However, Frances retained her composure and said there was nothing. At night, Nick came over to Frances' room. They had a chat where Frances admitted that both Melissa and Nick told her they both love each other on the same day. She did not understand what she is doing in between. She asks Nick if this makes her a bad person and Nick replies that it doesn't. The two were sad but still not willing to give each other up. Nick loved both of them and Frances couldn't just let Nick go. The two had sex that night and fell asleep for a while. But Bobby came over looking for Frances and saw Nick and Frances in bed together. Shocked, Bobby apologized and left the room. After Nick left, Frances came clean to Bobby over text that she was having an affair with Nick since Melissa's birthday. Episode number 6. Recap. Bobby and Frances were now back in Ireland, and they couldn't seem to look at each other. On the day they got back, Frances visited her mother and her mother suspected that Frances had a row with Bobby. Then, Frances had severe abdominal pain and she found blood all over her underwear. Her mother asked if it was her period, but Frances said it felt worse than her period and so, Frances' mother then asked if Frances could possibly be pregnant. Frances nodded and her mother sent her to the hospital. The doctor at the hospital ran some tests and Frances revealed she has been sexually active but has always used a condom and when they did not, Nick didn't come inside her. While she was awaiting her results, Frances tried calling Nick, but Nick thought she was drunk as she couldn't seem to tell him what's going on. In the evening, to Frances' relief, the results ended up being negative, showing that Frances was not pregnant. Nevertheless, she had to undergo a test by the gynecologist as the amount of pain she was in concerns the doctor. The same day she came back from the hospital, Frances received text messages from Bobby asking why Frances did not trust her with the information on Nick, and she didn't appreciate that she was open about her kiss with Melissa, but Frances held back. Frances wanted to talk rather than text, but when she called the next day, Bobby's phone was busy. Frances then proceeded to visit her alcoholic dad, Dennis. He wasn't at home, but Frances eventually found him outside a bar and walked him home. Dennis asked Frances if her mother sent her, but Frances denied it. She couldn't hold much of a conversation with her dad, and therefore excused herself. Dennis is left looking depressed. The next day, Frances headed back to Dublin. Frances met up with Bobby at a cafe, and Frances apologized for not telling Bobby about the affair. The two friends had a heart-to-heart talk about their friendship. Bobby felt like she was an intruder in Frances' life, but Frances told Bobby that she had always been the center of her life. They made up and Frances told Bobby about the miscarriage scare and how it confused her because she's sad about something that did not happen. Although Bobby called out Nick again for not using a condom, Frances protected him and told Bobby that her attitude towards Nick was the reason why she couldn't tell her about the affair. Back home, Frances started responding to Nick's text again and they started a call. Episode number 7. Recap. In the video call, they had a friendly chat in which Nick told her that he saw a girl today who looked just like her. Nick told Frances that he missed her and Frances invited him to come over when he arrived back at Dublin. The next morning, Bobby revealed that her parents are going through a messy divorce and therefore, she's planning to move closer to town. Hence, Frances invited her to rent the room at her place. Bobby moved in and the two further rekindled their friendship by looking through old photos. Frances asked Bobby if she was okay with Nick visiting that week, and Bobby was fine with it. The two friends that proceeded to party at a club that night. Meanwhile, Frances and Nick exchanged messages more often and talked about random things like their family and their day. The day Nick returned, he went to see Frances straight away. He brought pastries for her and she told him how classy he was. He said that she had a nice place and Frances told him that it was a nice coat he was wearing. After that Frances led him into the bedroom. Then the two proceeded to have sex. They spend the whole day together, going to a cafe and walking together in the town streets. Frances then finally bid him goodbye with a promise to meet again. The next day, Frances ditched Bobby and their friend group to hang out with Nick again. They spent more time talking about each other and telling each other about their interests. Nick asked if this was the first relationship Frances was in after Bobby and Frances said yes. She was happy he used the word relationship to describe them. During the week, Frances and Bobby bumped into Melissa at a bookstore and Melissa wanted to have coffee. Although reluctant, Frances eventually went and Melissa brought up that Nick is more relaxed after the Croatian vacation. Melissa also invited Nick and hearing that, Frances left the coffee shop, saying she has class. At home, Bobby admitted to Frances that it was difficult lying to Melissa as she still considered Melissa a friend. Nick kept coming over to Frances' apartment so they could spend time together. They both were more comfortable with each other now and opened up about their emotions. Frances told Nick that she wasn't very good at expressing her feelings and Nick told her that he was the same. Nick expressed to her that people did not find him to be very fun and Frances told him that she was just like him too. They were the two pieces of puzzle that fit perfectly together. After a few weeks, in one of their secret meetings Nick told Frances that these few weeks had been one of the best things in his life. He had to leave for another one of his theater roles and told her that he would miss her dearly. Nick also told Frances that he wanted to tell Melissa about the affair as he did not feel good lying to her. Although Frances was worried Melissa would stop Nick from seeing her, she ultimately told Nick to do what he thinks is best. Frances then told Bobby about Nick's decision after their housewarming, and Bobby said that she thinks that Nick must have been serious about her if he's telling Melissa. When asked by Bobby, Frances admitted that she's falling in love with Nick, and Bobby told Frances that she's happy for her. Episode number 8. Recap. It is Melissa's book launch and Frances and Bobby were both invited to attend. It is the second time
Frances sees Nick and Melissa getting comfortable with each other. She is tense throughout the ceremony as she sees Nick being proud of his wife.
They manage to chat in a friend group and Frances is completely closed off and awkward as Nick and Melissa lead the conversation.
Throughout the event, Nick's eyes were glued to his wife as well as the troubled Frances. She began to feel that Nick and Melissa are meant for each other and feeling insecure, she tried to get validation from Bobby, but her friend would not oblige. When she finally saw Nick turning her way, Frances tried to make him jealous by pulling at Bobby's hair and clothes. This angered Bobby, who thinks Frances is using her. At night, Bobby brought another woman home and they had an awkward encounter with Frances. Frustrated, Frances opened up a Tinder profile and got a date with a man called Rosa. The next day, Frances sent Bobby an email apologizing for her immature behavior. She proceeded on the date with Rosa and remained unimpressed by his stories and interests. However, Frances still slept with him at the end of the day.
Frances had dinner with Bobby and their mutual friend, Philip, the following day. Things got very heated when Bobby asked Frances where she went and Frances revealed that Bobby brought someone home. Eventually, Frances admitted to Philip that she was sleeping with Nick Conway. Shocked at the revelation, Philip commented that Nick was using Frances, and although he apologized later on, Frances started wondering if she was actually being taken advantage of. A few days later, Frances headed over to Nick's place after Nick invited her over. Melissa was not around. During dinner preparation, Frances admitted that she slept with a guy on Tinder. Initially, Nick was taken aback, but he eventually said Frances is free to sleep with whoever she wants to. Frances also commented about the Tinder date's poor taste in poems and his lack of skills in bed, which Nick scoffed at. The tension had already started to increase between them. It was obvious that Nick was upset about her date, but he was very good at hiding his emotions. After dinner, the two headed upstairs to have sex, but Nick couldn't proceed because he was bothered by Frances' actions. They had an argument because Nick did not like Frances sleeping with other people when she's angry at him, but Frances believed that he is not the injured party as he is married. Things escalated when Nick commented that Frances just likes to see him and Melissa arguing. As she couldn't take it anymore, Frances eventually got dressed, told Nick that the problem is that she loved him and he did not feel the same, and left crying. This was the climax of their relationship because both of them did not know what to do. She looked for Bobby when she got home, but Bobby was out. Therefore, she started writing until morning. Episode number 9. Recapped. It is revealed that the story Frances penned is about her relationship with Bobby. One morning, when she was getting coffee, Frances' card was declined as it was overdrawn and she found out her father has not been depositing money in. However, she couldn't get in touch with him. Frances also received a text from Valerie, Melissa's book agent, to have coffee and she obliged. Valerie told Frances that Melissa spoke highly of her and Valerie is willing to spend time looking through Frances' work. Although Frances was initially reluctant, she eventually agreed once Valerie prompted her to think about her career in writing. Frances submitted The Dance to Valerie. One night, once again, while having her period, Frances experiences extreme pain. Nick texted her, asking to talk, but Frances was too sick to reply. The next day, Frances was supposed to meet Bobby outside, but when she was nearby, she passed out. Bobby got extremely worried and immediately called for help from people nearby. In several minutes, Frances regained consciousness and Bobby took her home. Bobby also offered to take care of her, undressing her and preparing her a bath. Once Bobby got Frances into the bath, Frances felt much better and then opened up to her friend about her argument with Nick. When Bobby found out that Frances hasn't even told Nick about her miscarriage scare, she dialed Nick for her friend and Nick immediately volunteered to come over. When Nick arrived, Bobby got Frances out of the bath and left the couple to talk alone. Nick was extremely worried as he arrived to see Frances. He showed immense care and Frances told him about the potential miscarriage incident. She reminded him about the night she called and he thought she was drunk. She told him she was at hospital that night. Nick had no idea that Frances was in pain and suffering from the very beginning. However, Frances told him not to worry as the medical tests are not back yet. They then moved into another topic when Nick informed Frances that he had told Melissa. He said that he couldn't keep lying to her because he was serious about Frances and wanted her to be in his life forever.
To both their surprise, Melissa was not angry and was more worried about Nick as he was down. Nick also told Melissa his wish of still wanting to see Frances, and proclaimed his love for Frances. Frances was swooned, especially when Nick told her that he started loving her from the beginning. It was quite an emotional scene for both of them as Nick cried and finally opened up to her. The two patched up and Nick tugged Frances in bed, promising to stay the night and be happy from then on.
Episode number 10. Recapped. After invited by Melissa, Frances headed over to Melissa's place to have a conversation about what happened. Melissa admitted that she used to cheat on Nick first, but she felt very betrayed as she was the one encouraging Nick and Frances' friendship. Uneasy, Frances was quick to tell Melissa that she didn't understand what Melissa hoped to gain by telling her that. However, Melissa also went on telling Frances that Nick is much happier now that he's also seeing Frances, and she wanted to put his happiness first. Therefore, the book author suggested a lunch between the three of them, including Bobby again to work things out. Frances was at edge after the chat and told Bobby that she felt Melissa was invalidating her relationship with Nick. But Bobby gave Frances a reality check that Melissa was being generous to want to work things out despite being the party that was being hurt by the affair. Few days later, Frances and Bobby headed over to Melissa's place to join her and Nick for dinner. It was a little tense for Frances, but Nick was calmer than before because the truth was finally out. Melissa made both of them sit together at the dinner table. Slowly Frances started to feel calmer as well. During dinner, Melissa brought up that Nick used to sleep with his 45-year-old tutor when he was 19. Nick told them that he really wanted to end it, but the lady kept clinging on to him. The conversation made Frances feel uneasy. Melissa also made an effort to connect with Frances by telling her she's writing about her dad, who happens to be an alcoholic like Frances' dad. However, Frances wasn't very reciprocal, and before she left, she told Nick she finds the whole thing with Melissa weird. And Nick told her it's not easy for anyone. The next day, Frances went for a checkup for her period pains and spent the day with Nick. She asked if he'd like her if she was pregnant, and they both had a light-headed conversation about parents and babies. Nick said he was quite fond of pregnant women, and Frances said that it was a fetish for him, which made both of them laugh. She tried calling her dad, but again, he did not pick up the call. Later on, Frances got a message from Valerie, and turns out, her story will be published in a magazine. Frances celebrated the news with Nick. She told him that it was her first real job and first paycheck. Nick asked who was the short story about, and Frances told him that it was about Bobby. But she still hasn't told Bobby yet. Nick implored Frances to tell Bobby as the story is about her. The following day, Frances just noticed a voicemail from her dad from the night before. Dennis was breathing heavily and told Frances he couldn't do it anymore. Worried, Frances tried calling again, and when she failed, she told her mom. Paula eventually got back to Frances at night, informing her that Dennis is safe. He is sick, but he is now with Frances' uncle. One night, at a dinner with their group of friends, the topic of monogamy and exclusivity came up. Philip, Andrew and several other couples brought up that some people prefer to be monogamous. However, Bobby fought for the idea of polygamy by bringing up that monogamy is a societal construct to promote the patriarchal structure society once lived in. Frances supported in several areas, but Bobby was particularly adamant about her view that night. Frances and Bobby then took a breather outside, where Bobby opened up about her troubles at home. Bobby's mom would possibly move back to the US after the divorce, and Bobby is stuck with her dad. It became an emotional moment for Bobby, and Frances apologized for not taking note of her friend's struggles. Then, Bobby and Frances shared a long kiss on the lips before heading back up. Frances was seen to be a bit confused by her own actions after that. Episode number 11. Recap. During a coffee conversation, Nick Conway told Frances about his relationship with Melissa in the past year. Nick finally opened up to Frances about his depression phase last year. Nick's director was a narcissistic man who was strict towards Nick and finally kicked him out of the film in the end. Nick felt like a disappointment and started smoking a lot. Then Melissa and Nick had an argument in which she told him she didn't want children. Nick has always wanted children of his own, and this absolutely broke Nick down, as that was not their previous agreement. Nick didn't get up after that, he slept all day, took drugs and was close to dying. After ignoring Melissa for a while, Nick was shocked when Melissa confessed that she was sleeping with their best friend. However, Melissa was extremely regretful and was willing to work things out again with Nick. Melissa was the one who supported him financially when he was down. Still, the couple decided to sleep in separate rooms. Then, the married couple soon met Bobby and Francis. Nick was still recovering from depression when Francis arrived in his life. And Francis was the one who pulled him out of the darkness. They expressed how happy they make each other and conversation lightened up after that. Francis assured Nick that it is not too late to be a father and that she believed he would be a good father. After expressing their emotions, Nick asked if he could walk Francis to her mom because that is where she was going after that. Francis agreed and they both went to meet her mom. Nick was a gentleman as always and her mom was very impressed. However, he didn't join them for dinner and left early. Few days after, Francis went to the hospital to get the radiology report. Although she received good news that there weren't any cyst or cancerous elements in her body, Francis was diagnosed with endometriosis, which can potentially cause fertility issues. This revelation affected Francis deeply, but she continued to hide this from her mother, Bobby and Nick. She kept it to herself and instead Googled about it at night.
During a call with Nick where she told him the diagnosis result went fine, Francis was hit with another piece of information. Nick told Francis that he kissed and slept with Melissa again. Startled, Francis pretended everything is fine but quickly cut the call short. Francis soon told Bobby about her struggle as she doesn't know how to process this information. Bobby called her out as the two of them kissed the other night, but Francis brushed it off as different.
During Nick's birthday party, Francis was visibly tense. She could not accept the fact that Nick was sleeping both with her and his wife. She tried to bring up to Nick that she could not accept the fact that he was with his wife again, and used a rather confronting tone with him. Nick wanted to talk some other time and by luck, his sister came about with his niece. Nick clearly loves children and was absolutely charmed by the baby. After a bit of push, Francis held the baby and felt extreme sadness due to her possible infertility. She was extremely sad inside but couldn't tell anyone. After that she then went home early because she couldn't bear to be around people. Nick tried to talk things out and went after her but she had had enough. The next morning, Bobby confronted Francis about her short story. Melissa had shown Bobby the story during the party and Bobby was furious. In the story, Francis described herself as someone who's jealous about Bobby as life seemed so easy for her, who's never quite serious and never fully joking. Bobby found her friend's description of her dehumanizing and could not believe that that is how Francis has viewed her. Bobby was mad because she didn't even bother to tell her that it was about her. After getting an earful from Bobby, Francis is left in the house crying. After some time, Francis met up with Nick to have a proper chat. Nick asked if she would like him to leave Melissa, and Francis said no. Francis started crying, admitting that she is not handling things well, and ultimately suggested that the both of them should stop seeing each other. Nick obviously didn't want to leave her and he was extremely sad about not knowing what to do. Nick apologized for making her unhappy but confirmed with her that a breakup is what she wants, to which Francis nodded. Nick decided to leave her only because she wanted them to separate and both of them sat there with heavy hearts. The very last episode. Episode number 12 recap. Francis wanted to patch things up with Bobby but could not sort her feeling out. In an impulse, she called Melissa and asked her why she showed Bobby her story. Melissa replied asking her why she fucked her husband. Still angry, Francis accused Melissa of trying to bring her down by purposefully causing a rift between her and Bobby. Melissa was not happy with the accusation and called Francis a narcissist for thinking that what everyone did was because of her. The book author then explained that she genuinely did not expect that Francis hadn't told Bobby, but she couldn't deny feeling glad that she wasn't the only person Francis did not treat well and pass baseless judgments about.
Melissa also gave Francis an earful for sleeping with Nick and dumping him when things get rough, causing Nick to be upset for days. When Francis came to her senses, she apologized to Melissa and Melissa was kind enough to put her anger aside to make sure Francis is okay as well. The next day, Francis wrote a heartfelt message to Bobby apologizing for her actions, and revealing her true emotions, something Bobby always asked her to do.
Frances admitted that she never understood why they couldn't be together and that she wants to sleep with Bobby. Bobby visited her the next day, and the two made up and had sex. In the morning, both girls laid their feelings bare and made clear what they want from the relationship moving forward. They decided not to move in together again and be committed to one another. After that day, Bobby and Frances resumed their romantic relationship. Occasionally, she looked at her old photos with Nick. She finally opened up to her father and talked things out with him as well. Her dad was in rehab and feeling much better. Then she talked things out with her mother as well, filling in the gaps of their relationship and promising to open up from now on about what was happening in her life. After some time, Frances has healed and was now dating Bobby. One day, when she was browsing a bookstore for a Christmas present for Bobby, she received a call from Nick, which he claimed was a misdial. They caught up with each other's lives through phone. Frances told Nick the truth about why she broke up with him. She let him know about her infertility and how she was worried that her body would not feel good to Nick. This made Nick's voice sadder as all this while, he thought he wasn't what she wanted. Frances even apologized to Nick for her hypocritical behavior. She faulted him for being in love with Melissa while she herself was in love with Bobby the whole time. Nick then professed his love to Frances again, confessing that he always waited for her, because he felt some sort of impulse to make himself available to her. After a long pause, Frances said,
"Come and get me."
And the episode ended on that scene, leaving the rest for imagination. Thank you so much for watching the complete series recap. Leave a like if you enjoyed because it encourages us to make better content, and as always have a great day.